I want to thank all of our panelists for their remarks and for sharing their case studies with us and their experiences within their countries. Just to kick things off, I have a question for all of our panelists. And it comes from a theme that I noted in all of your presentations, and that was speaking about partnerships. When Sahar provided her introductory remarks, one of the things that was noted in the survey was that a challenge was related to the inability to clarify roles and responsibilities at times. And I think in each of your presentations, there was a range of models of partnerships, going from enshrining it into law or a specific organizational structure to informal partnerships. So my question to each of the panelists is whether you can comment on the approaches that you've taken in order to solidify the partnerships that you've engaged in.
I have described the kind of relationship that we have in Italy. I would like to comment on the importance of having a daily contact between civil protection decision makers and the scientists, because in this way we can learn each other what we can do and what we cannot do, which are the needs and which are the possibilities. And also we develop a common language. That's one of the most important points, because in many cases we have the same words that mean different things, or the same meanings with different words. So it is important that we develop together a common way of, a common language, a common glossary, how can I say? So the most important point is that we work side by side every day during the ordinary times and during the emergencies.
Great, if I can go to John.
Thanks very much. If I can just continue with what Danielle has just said. Yeah, language is really important because we're dealing with different stakeholders, different disciplines, different sectors. We've got also different scientific partners. Language is different in each of those, and getting a common language is really important. It's not just language; it's actually making sure that people understand responsibilities and in relation to how they're going to deal with the risks, whether that's during an emergency or looking at planning. Sometimes that has to be elaborated as well, because at the moment that is pretty unclear in many cases.
Great, thank you. And Liza and Jethro, do you have some comments there?
Yes, to solidify partnership, I think we have mentioned, Jethro mentioned about the National Disaster Risk Reduction Council. This is multi-agencies cooperating with each other, communicating with each other. I think aside from that, we have also co-partner with academe. But I think the most important part why we were able to sustain the partnership is that, as you notice, we are really a disaster-prone countries. Almost every month we have, typhoons and disaster. So we always communicate not only in the national level, but also to the local levels, up to the villages, which is the smallest unit of the society in the Philippines. I think the key word here is sustained communication.
Thank you. And Richard?
Right. Yeah, I think in addition to the comments made by other panelists, I think in terms of, yes, partnerships are key. And in terms of developing them, one has to make sure that you're on the same page in terms of what you expect to get out of the partnership. I think at the get-go, you have to ensure that we are on the same page and we have at least a commonality of interests and a commonality in terms of how we see it proceeding. Often things may not work if one party come into it thinking one way and the other party is slightly different. So it's very important to work on making sure we know what we are getting out of it and what we're putting into it. And secondly, I'd say that it's important to work on the partnerships. It takes a long time to build meaningful partnerships. It's a lot of effort. It involves a lot of interaction with people. I heard that from a previous panel where you have to actually see people and meet people and talk to them, interact with them. So I think it works well if you work on making sure that it works. In other words, you have to put the effort in and make sure you understand where you're coming from. That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. So we can't just snap our fingers. We need to actually
Exactly.
meet face to face,
Yep.
which no doubt has been challenging in the last number of years. But
Yep.
these platforms like what we're hosting today help remind us, I think, about the importance of those connections and investing in those relationships. I think we also heard in the previous panel that some of that is personal relationships. There are also institutional relationships that I think that we all try to maintain as in our roles within our organizations. I think another important element of geological survey organizations and how they reach out and respond to queries from other parts of the civil society. I'll go to the questions in the chat in just a minute, but I wanted to pick up on a theme that I also heard through the talks as well, which was related to I think, Lisa, your point about sustained communication, and I noticed the need for education, information, communication, also with the public. And my question is really centered around how that gets supported and how we divide our efforts, often as science and technology organizations, between producing the information and also having sufficient activities that allow us to communicate the importance of the work. Anybody want to jump in there? Yes?
I can add on that. No,
Thank you.
We have a regular program, no? The IEC, we have targets of different LGUs every year. So right now, I think we have 15 cities or municipalities targeted just for the central office. So our 15 regional offices also have their regular targets. So in this this regularity in this project is a way to institutionalize the sustained communication with the not just with the local government units, but how they cascade these informations, and also the importance of having the materials, the flyers and posters that we have. I think I mentioned it that we translated our posters to 9 major languages because the nature of the Philippines, since it is archipelagic, I think per region you have a major language. So I think it's important that we have the language is sensitive, as pointed out in the first question. The language between agencies, but also the language with the public is important.
But there are challenges actually in terms of communicating and educating. The challenge is really how we translate the geoscience information, that it could be understandable and could be appreciated by the local communities. I think that's and I mean, another challenge is really the feedback mechanism, how this information education campaign is being, understood and implemented and became what you call this, help them, in their disaster management plan and during early warning system or early warnings to, to be prepared in times of disaster.
If I can add to that, I'll say in terms of communication, you have to use a variety of techniques. Okay, so my colleagues there from the Philippines mentioned some. We have used audio, video, posters of various kinds, and in fact, you also have to try to interact with people at different levels. So we have communicated with communities directly, with disaster managers, with regional disaster managers, and in each of them you have to have a different set of products. Sometimes it's really a lot of work. And finally, I'll say that as much as you can, you have to give voice to the people who are in the community. So we have actually used, for example, we have a poet in St. Vincent who wrote a poem about 79 eruption. We took that and he made it into an animation that animated what he said, and then we fed that back into people to tell them what the volcano had done. So you have to do lots of different things, and you have to actually have skilled people apart from the scientists themselves. I'll recommend you have to actually have people who are skilled in the art of communications working in your team.
Another thing which is quite important is not only the products you generate to allow people to understand what the risks they are facing are, but it's actually timing. Timing is very important. And one of the things we've noticed is that we produce a lot of products which are designed for the public It's only when people have got a particular interest they'll actually look at a lot of those products. So, for instance, it's when someone wants to buy a house, they might be worried about what geohazards they may be susceptible to. But the other thing which is quite we've noticed is during an emergency, whether it's a flooding emergency or after an emergency, we find a much bigger uptake of the science we've generated and much better take up from that.
Daniela.
Yeah, just to say that in Italy we have an experience about a communication campaign that is carried out by our volunteers. It's called I Don't Take Risks. And we have our research institutes that help us to train volunteers. These volunteers then train other volunteers, and we have a lot of activities during a weekend in one per year with 100 squares where these volunteers have their gazebos and they present the different risks to their population. So they talk the same language, because the volunteers are from the towns and the cities where these gazebos are placed, where the squares are open. So they know each other and they can be much more easy to be understood by the population. So this is a good experience in our case. But a point is, in general, is how to measure the effectiveness of these campaigns. This is very difficult. I know that also at the European level, they are starting to think about this.
Yeah, I think that whole field of risk communication and evaluation around the effectiveness is a very important gain science policy challenge that luckily some of the academic cadre are taking on as well. I think it's very interesting in the remarks because I heard in there that timing is often very critical in terms of gathering both political attention, which we heard in the last panel, and also the public's attention. And that can be related to an event. It can also be related to kind of life events, such as purchasing a home or a large investment or things like that, that create a window in people's minds of considering risk. I think that's important. There's a theme here also of communicating uncertainty that I think that underlies all of the comments that I've heard around that last question, because I think that's a challenge. Framing uncertainty, framing probabilistic assessments is still a kind of broader societal challenge. With that, I have another question for the panel, and it relates really to the private sector. We spoke about partnerships, and I'm wondering about if any of your countries have experience in partnerships with the private sector and what that might look like for the various hazards that you are responsible for.
Yes, I think it is in place in our policy, the public and private partnership in the RRM. So private companies, they have this program that they included in their corporate social responsibility. They also assist us not only in providing, funds or goods during disaster, but even in the IEC campaign. So we are in partnership with them. We provided them geologists to conduct lectures, and they did, organize communities to listen to us and organize a barangay-based or village-based DRRM council, and that is the role of those private sector in the country.
Yeah, we've had similar experiences. I'd say, if anything, we have worked with the private sector to a large extent, mainly in the process of providing them with information and expertise in hazards. I don't think we are satisfied with the extent to which they have invested in sort of advancing some of that, and that's something that we've tried hard to. We've had some very good relationships with there's some insurance facilities and some, where I'm based in Trinidad, the oil facilities, where we have gone to them and they've actually provided some limited funding to do certain things, but not you know, it's a work in progress. I think it's something that's needed more, certainly in our parts of the world. But you know, you have to find ways of marketing it to them such that they see the benefits not only to their workers' upliftment, but also to their own perception in the public.
If I can come in there, yes. So we work with industry quite a lot, in both in the short term. So we provide services. I mentioned some of those in space weather, but for instance, we've got early warning systems to help shut down reactors, for instance, nuclear reactors in the case of an earthquake. We don't get many earthquakes in the UK, but when one occurs, we can shut down the reactor very quickly. That's a private arrangement. But on the other end, we work a lot with the insurance industry, also looking at long-term risks, and you know, the insurance industry is obviously very keyed in with the public. And provides something of an interface for us as a science community to make sure a lot of the science we do ends up in products and services which are going to be much more widely applicable.
Daniela, do you have a comment there?
From our side, the approach to the private sector is quite different. We have the private sector behind us in the management of the emergencies, for dealing with the energy sector or the telecommunication sector. They are around the same table where we manage the emergency. So we share with them the scientific information that we obtain from our competence centers. But I think that's a little bit different from what Geological Survey can do with a collaboration with the private sectors, of course. But yes, for us it's important. And I can say that I was 1 week ago in Sweden for the meeting for the presidency of the semester by Sweden in the European Parliament. And one of the topics was exactly the involvement of the private sector in all the activities. And when it comes to this involvement at the national level, we have to face with the different regulation that each country has in the relationship with the private sector and the public administration. So it's an interesting issue, really.
Great, thank you all for your thoughts there. It's something that I've been noticing increasingly with Canada's involvement with the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, where that model of public-private collaboration that exists within that community helps explore some of that space in a productive manner. So thanks for your remarks in that regard. At this time, I wanted to actually pose a question to the panelists, both in this session and in the first session, just to kind of round out our conversation across the two sessions. And my question there is really related to roles. And so with that, we've been talking about collaboration. We've talked about knowledge sharing mechanisms. One example is the organization of this webinar, for example. It's been used for knowledge sharing. Even just today, I've learned a lot, some from organizations that I was aware of, other models that I hadn't been aware of. And I'm wondering, like this type of mechanism amongst geological survey organizations and their civil protection or disaster risk reduction counterparts that focuses around geohazards and risks around the world. Does that create a kind of space where we're able to learn from each other? And if so, how are we able to do that? And if not, what are things that we might be able to do to improve?
I can come in to start with. One of the things I think is very useful, or would be very useful, is to have almost a community of practice where we can, in a fairly informal environment, engage in what works and what doesn't work, show what we've done, what we haven't done, and learn. We can jointly learn lessons about the effectiveness of what we're delivering. I think we're all there's no single answer to any problem here. And I think the more we can be open about those experiences we've had and how successful what we've done has been, I think the better it would be for many of us. how we engender that, how we build that is a good question. How we make sure that's sustained is not something which is simple, but I think that would have considerable value.
Thanks, John. Is there anybody else that would like to chime in on that one? Daniela?
I may say that we find this kind of activities very useful. And for instance, we also experience this kind of interaction with GEM, who often organizes this kind of workshop of where we can exchange our experiences. But I think that it would be better in general if this kind of webinars are focused on the exchange of good practices that we can present, from which we can learn how to manage problems that we have from different points of view. So if we have more than a general overview, from time to time, a specific point, a target or goal that we address in a webinar, this could be very helpful.
Yes, Liza and
Sorry.
Jetta?
Oh, sorry.
I would like to
Sorry.
commend this webinar. This is a very good start. I think it's very important that I agree, maybe set a regular, exchange of knowledge, experiences internationally. Success stories also. We really need to know what are the experiences so that we can also apply, and maybe we can share more also that others could apply. So I guess this is a very good forum where we can share ideas for the RRN and climate change adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. Sahar?
Yes, thanks, Sonia. I also very much believe this has huge potentials for creating that space for exchange of knowledge. From my own point of view, a lot of the time I work as a consultant supporting the government in designing new mechanisms, or right now we are working on designing the framework for our province disaster and climate risk assessment. Obviously, we always go out and look at the great work of other jurisdictions by reading their documents and things that are published. Of course, you learn so much from that. But if you could have a chance to listen to people who have gone through the whole process from beginning to the end, and few of those people, right, like the representatives from the various entities that have come together to make the project a success, you end up learning a lot more. Just recently, we had a meeting with FEMA, with Mike and his team, and they got deeper, showed way more detail about the National Risk Index, which was extremely educational. So basically both formats of short presentation and discussion, but also some sessions dedicated to more in-depth sharing of successful and good practices.
Thanks, Sahar. Malaika Olmi, do you have some comments?
Thank you, Sonia, and thanks to this panel. And I would, to that question, I would say I learned a lot today about both the formal and informal mechanisms that some other organizations are using to connect science with users for disaster risk reduction. So I think there's great value in having that ongoing conversation. I think the mechanism is tricky, as Daniela mentioned. For those of us who are engaged with the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, that can be one helpful venue, but it's a bit more narrowly focused. I think finding a mechanism to bring us together, and maybe that's through the World Committee of Geological Surveys as well, something to sustain an ongoing conversation is really helpful. So thanks to those for sharing today too.
Richard, I'll turn to you to see if you have any comments on this part.
Well, just to endorse what everybody has said, I think particularly in terms of what John said about sharing best practices and experiences, I think that's the most useful. So I think I've learned a lot about what different agencies do. I think that's quite useful. But the challenge is always the mechanism by which it can be done and also sustain it. But this is a start, and I suggest that if we can have more of this kind of exchange of experiences. That'll be quite useful to all of us. One critique I would have, though, and this is more to Saha and her survey, which I suspect is limited by where you did it. But if you notice, it was very much skewed towards a certain part of the world, which I think means that you have a certain perception of the world. There's a lot of fantastic work being done in other parts of the world, which I suspect as you widen your survey, you'll discover. And I'm sure you know already, but I think that's one critique I'll have.
Thank you, Richard. Absolutely, we hear your point, and we did our best possible, but thank you for being honest that we should try harder. Thank you.
That's fair. I mean, if we're going to come together as a community, we need to be able to share our perspectives. It's a very important point of addressing these global challenges. At this point, I also wanted to just bring up an additional theme that I heard through this last panel session and throughout the morning, actually. And that's related to funding. And I know it's a complicated question because we're operating in a complicated space. And I think we know from undertaking risk assessments writ large that there are great inequities associated with those that are exposed to risk globally. At the same time, I think it's my perception anyhow that almost no matter where we are, there is an approach to either cobbling together funding, working with informal partnerships, trying to time our asks to political masters in such a way to capitalize on the work that we know that needs to be done. And so at this juncture, I'll just open it to any comments that anyone might have related to options for sustaining funding or for looking at different funding models that might play out in this space.
If I could just jump in first, because I think one of my big issues was the funding issue, and that's an issue that we constantly struggle with. And I agree with you, it's not an uncommon problem with agencies like ourselves. But to a certain extent, I'm optimistic that it will change, because I think that we're moving into a space in the world where, because of the very nature of the hazards that we're exposed to, and the nature of hazards and the whole aspect of climate change, that whether or not governments and agencies want to, they will have to invest more in terms of the natural hazards and in terms of all that required. So I think that's one thing. The other point I'll make is a point I think I made a long time ago. I think it was in the first Understanding Risk conference that the World Bank hosted in Washington, where I was then pushing it back onto agencies like the World Bank, those major funding agencies, that they need to a certain extent put as much pressure as they can. And I think they have begun to do that on the governments that they fund, to put more resources onto agencies that do natural hazards and that kind of work. So they now build into sort of their funding some aspect of hazards awareness and acknowledgement of that. And I think as much as they can do that, it will force to a certain extent the very government, because some of it is political too, the very governments to ensure that they fund and then ensure that they advance that aspect of the work in their territories.
John?
On that last point about funding, I think there are a number of things too that we can do better, perhaps to attract funding, and of course sharing of information and knowledge is one thing where we, if we're better about having appropriate tools, open source, and all this sort of stuff and databases where we can share and transfer knowledge, we can lessen the load, I suppose, in some respects, and gain more traction. The other end of it, I think, also being able to really demonstrate where the work that we're doing is actually making a difference. And I think as scientists, from my side, perhaps we struggle a little bit with this because we don't always see where the risk assessment goes. We don't always know if it's ending up in policy or good practice. And that timeline is so long that the cause and effect is often hard to actually connect, is actually hard to make. So I think we could do better as a community in really demonstrating the impact, the cost effectiveness, the importance of the knowledge, and the whole chain of information through to implementation. Thanks.
And John Rees.
Yeah, I was basically going to follow up on a bit what other people have said. Yeah, we've got challenges in funding. There's long-term funding. There's no doubt, particularly when we recognise that the amount of time we've got to spend with partnerships, particularly with stakeholders, users of the information. Those long-term relationships need a lot of investment, a lot of time. So that's a challenge. On the upside, though, and other people have touched upon this, climate change and climate change impacts are very much a rising agenda. So we do find that our government and other governments, in particular, are very interested in climate change impacts, and I think we can use that developing agenda to kind of actually support a lot of what we're doing in hazards across the piece.
If I can add, I think as science organizations, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, I think this last panel has made clear the value of communication, and yet that's often not where our budgets go when we are limping along with limited funding. And so targeting some of our core resources to that communication piece, I think, behooves us all to have the ongoing support, and is somewhere I think we could focus more of our resources potentially.
Just if I can come in on communication, the other thing which is important about communication is part of the journey. Unless we've changed behaviour, we've not really succeeded. Whether we're looking at short-term or long-term responses to risks. So I think communication is key to that, but it's only part of the portfolio of things we have to worry about in making that change in behaviour.
Daniela?
I jump in about funding from a governmental point of view, because we are one of the administration who funds research and applied research and monitoring and so on from our research institutes. I think that we could work better, and you as Geological Surveys and similar institutions could help us in trying to optimizing the resources that are available on different administrations. For instance, in Italy, but also in Europe, we have research funded by European General Directorates, or in Italy funded by the Ministry of Research and University, that are not strictly agreed with those who work in the civil protection or in the risk management field. So if you help us in put together this administration, we are doing this we are doing a big effort to try to optimize the funds of different administration to obtain the best results from you. But also, I think that you could also help us in doing this. This would help because we could obtain better results, and we can have more. In this way, we could have more funds for the same goal.
Great. Thank you all for your comments in this regard. I think as we started this session, we were well aware that it's a complex space that we work in, one that has overlap and challenges across science, policy, and decision making, and that we're all trying to approach this in our national, regional, and local contexts to be able to contribute productively on the way forward. At this juncture, I just wanted to draw attention to one of the questions in the Q&A related to what is probably not an uncommon situation with countries with a smaller population that are lacking scientific capacity for basic hazard assessments. So I mostly just want to draw attention to that. There's some interaction in the chat where there is potentially a group that can assist, but I think bears sharing just with the group that is there are a range of needs in terms of both scientific assessments, hazard, vulnerability, and risk across this space of disaster risk reduction. With that, I also wanted to share with all of the participants a sense of the extent of our reach through this webinar series. So today's session has had variably upwards of about 150 participants across the 3 webinar sessions. The next ones over the next 2 weeks, we have over 600 registrants. So I think it starts to point to that communication theme that we were just discussing within the panel in terms of you know, the continuation of various existing networks, either within the science and technical aspect or the public safety aspect and civil protection aspect of this disaster risk reduction work. So you know, I'm pleased with the response, and I think that goes some measure to continuing the conversation about how to tackle these wicked problems. And so with that, I will close this panel session, and I wanted to thank all of our panelists, Richard, John Reese, Daniela Debucci, Lisa, Jethro, for your contributions, for sharing your work with us as part of this panel, looking at case studies. I think we have all acknowledged that we have a lot to learn from each other, and by you sharing your presentations, it's given us each a kind of a leg up on your experiences and how we might fold that into our own organizations. So I thank you very much for that. We're coming up near the end of this first part of our 3-part webinar series. So I'll move to my closing remarks as the overall Part 1 chair of this Disaster Risk Reduction Forum.